Hey guys, it's Max here, and today I'm going to talk about how to write a DBQ. This is going to be the revised DBQ rubric for the AP Histories. It's going to be the same rubric for all three histories: AP World, AP Euro, and AP APUSH. Yeah, this is only for 2020 with the revised DBQ rubric. So let's get right into it. In 2020, we're going to have a couple of changes. The big change is the time and the amount of documents they give you. So it's 45 minutes, 5 documents. Then if we go and look at the rubric, which I highly recommend Tom Ritchie's rubric. He has an online rubric that you can download for free. So I highly recommend looking at that. Okay, so we have the new rubric. It's 10 points now instead of the 7 we had before. And I'm just going to go over it really quickly. So 1 point is for contextualization, 1 point for thesis again. Then with documents, you can get 5 points. You can analyze 2 documents, talk about them for 1 point. And then for 2 documents, you can analyze and address the thesis for 1 point. And then you can do 2 more documents, so that's 4 documents in total that you analyze and address the thesis for your 3rd point. Then for sourcing, you don't need to do 3 documents anymore. Now you can do 2. And each document you source is a point. Then for outside evidence, now you have to bring in 2 pieces of outside evidence instead of 1. And there's a lot of time period changes. So it's all the first. It's different for pretty much every exam. And you gotta ask your teacher for more. But I know for Euro, it's units 1 through 7. So, yeah. So, there's 2 parts of an approach to the AP History exams this year. So the first part is basically knowing your information, having the info in front of you. And that's really just preparation before. That's paying attention in class, reading your history books, etc., doing your study guides. So what I want to focus on specifically is getting ready for the actual test itself. So for this, it's a good idea. I know a lot of Stanton teachers are doing a bunch of practice DBQs, and that's good, and you need to keep doing that. So since this year the exam is at home and it's open notes, so here's what I would think to do before you write it. So obviously practice, obviously know what info you're going to talk about. But in addition, I strongly recommend having the rubric in front of you. So like I talked about the Tom Ritchie rubric, that's great. That's what I use. That's what my teacher uses. So you can know exactly if you're getting a point or not, because it says right on the rubric if you're getting the point and how to get the point. Then have a study guide or info sheets or something. This is more personal, but this is just a quick reference to get information or to jog your memory about a certain topic and time period, since we don't know exactly which time period it's going to be. Just to save you time from having to look up every single piece of information you need. Or, ideally, you learn everything, but that's not going to happen. So these study guides or info sheets are going to help a ton. And last but not least, practice your DBQs. Alright. So the intro for these DBQs is largely going to be the same. The big thing with the intro is that the thesis is going to change. But let's do contextualization. For contextualization, it's largely the same, but basically contextualization, that's what happens before, what happens after. You're painting the picture, you're telling what's going on. So I usually write around 5 sentences, and the big thing is that it needs to kind of paint the picture, like I will keep saying, about your time period and what's going on. And then in the introduction also, you need to have your thesis. The thesis, I will talk about the thesis a little bit later, but basically it's 1 to 2 sentences, introduce complexity points. Remember to rewrite your thesis in the conclusion. Okay, AP, all the review videos, it's been big on this one. Rewrite your thesis in the conclusion. Not just restate it word for word, but rewrite the idea So, because if you're not getting the point in your introduction, then you may have a chance to get it in your conclusion. I personally never found that helpful, but AP is big on it, so go ahead and do that. Then let's focus on your thesis specifically. So your thesis is really, really, really important. It's the most important part of your essay. Because without it, you have no chance of getting a 5, and it's going to be hard to get a 4 because these thesis points that you're automatically losing, you're losing 3 points without the thesis. And yeah, at least 3. So those are the easier points that you can get. So don't miss out on these easy points. One thing I want you guys to always remember is for these DBQs, any DBQ, your thesis is going to be dictated by the documents. So whatever the documents say, that's what you're going to be writing about. So let's break up the thesis. The thesis needs to have 2 parts. It needs to have the argument, respective of the prompt, and it needs to have supporting details that you're going to use, that you're going to talk about later in the sentence. So the argument states your position, and the supporting details lay out what you're going to talk about for the essay. Let's look at a thesis that I wrote. So this is kind of complex, kind of not, but I did not introduce the complexity point here that we'll get to in a little bit. This is talking about whether the 30 Years' War is more of a political conflict or a religious conflict. So I wrote, although it began due to a religious disagreement, the 30 Years' War was a more political conflict, as evidenced by international alliances by countries of different predominant religions, the roles of politiques in war, and the resulting shift in the balance of power in Europe. So I did introduce the complexity point here, but I will talk about that later. Let's analyze this thesis, how it is. We have the 2 parts. My argument relative to the prompt is that the 30 Years' War is a political conflict, and then we have my supporting details. We have as evidenced, so you want a keyword kind of showing this is what's supporting. So as evidence, because things like that, that's going to make it kind of clear. You know, that's clear that these are your supporting details. So as evidenced by alliances between countries of different religions, role of politics in the war, and the resulting shift of the balance of power in Europe. So 3 things that I'm going to talk about later in the essay that are my supporting details, basically. That being said, all my teachers are saying that you need 3 supporting details. You do not need them necessarily. You will still get the point with 2. I strongly recommend 3 though, because as long as you have 3 things to talk about, it's better to talk about 3. You have a wider range of evidence. But the one thing you do not want to do is you do not want to write 3 points and then only talk about 1 or 2 of them, because then that's not a good thesis, right? Let's say I talk about alliances with predominant religions and the shift in the balance of power in Europe, but I don't talk about politics, right? Then it's not good to have this part of the thesis in my thesis, right? So don't be afraid if you don't have 3 points. Just write what you have and write with conviction. Another thing about the thesis, it's a good idea to introduce your complexity point. Complexity is basically your complex understanding of the topic your prompt is on. Here, I introduce complexity with saying that the 30 Years' War began with a religious disagreement, but it is more of a political conflict. So, I'm introducing complexity here through basically choosing both sides. I chose my side that I believe in, but I'm also showing the other side of the argument, right? If that makes sense. And we'll come back to that for sure. So then this is a DBQ, so let's look at the documents. There will be 5 documents on our DBQs, and here's what you want to do. First, you want to read every document, at least skim it. If you're tight on time or you're a slow reader, at least skim it so you have the general idea or understanding, basically the message or the purpose of the document. Now, keep an eye on purpose, because we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Then there's a point that you can get specifically for talking about 2 documents, that point is you automatically get that point as long as you relate these two or more documents to the thesis, right? So you automatically get that point. So we're not even going to focus on the understanding point because you need to understand it in order to support your thesis with the document. So use two documents to support your thesis, and you get the 1 point for this as well as the 1 point for understanding two documents. And then if you use 4 or more, then you get 2 points plus the 1 for understanding the documents. Then you're going to have 2 points that are sourcing. There's been a lot of talk about sourcing right now. A lot of people have this similar acronym. It's the same thing. HIP, HAP, it's the same thing. How I like to remember it is what's happening, right? So what is happening? And HAP stands for, if you don't already know, historical context, and that audience, purpose, and point of view. This basically explains how is the document affected, what is unique about the document, and how it affects the message and the content of the document. Now you see that's why I put message and purpose, because purpose I don't suggest putting as a sourcing thing by itself. Purpose is kind of a transitionary period between understanding the document, supporting it, and sourcing the document. So what I like to do for sourcing is use 2 or 3 of these. A really good one to lump together is audience and purpose, because with your audience, you have a specific audience of your document, then you also have a purpose that this is your audience. So that's a great one to do 2 on it. But technically you only need 1 of these. I like to do this 2 because it really shows the understanding of the documents. So then, outside evidence. Outside evidence is why you need your prepared information. It's why you need these note sheets, or just know everything, I guess. But that's not really, like I said, that's not really going to happen. So pre-written info, note sheets. That's going to be the big thing here. Basically, you're just using it as you would a document to support your argument. You know, this is evidence. It's kind of self-explanatory. You explain the event, or you explain your outside evidence, and you use it to support the argument. And you need to do this twice on this exam, and you get a point for each time you use outside evidence to support an argument. Then finally we get to complexity. Now there's a lot of talk about complexity being the hardest point, and you shouldn't try to get it unless you have spare time or something like that. That's just wrong, you know? This essay itself is not that hard. A lot of people put that into their mind that it is hard, but as long as you follow these simple patterns, it's not that hard. So, complexity. It's said to be the hardest point. It's really not. Here's why. You have choices to make from complexity. So the rubric, Tom Ritchie rubric, has about 5 points. I'm just going to talk about the 3 that I've used before. So you can compare it to a different time period. This is a good one. If you have a similarity going on in your time period, I did a video on new monarchs, and I compared new monarchs to absolute monarchs, right? For example, this is an example of complexity. Let me back up. Complexity is basically showing your enhanced understanding of a topic. So new monarchs are similar to absolute monarchs and paved the way towards absolute monarchs. This would be comparing it to a different time period and showing that the similarity stayed. The second way I do it is, I've done complexity, is use the opposite skill that's mentioned in the prompt. So I did not make a prompt with this, but a lot of prompts are going to be compare and contrast, or continuity over time, right? Continuity or change. And it's rare that it's going to say compare and contrast. It's going to say compare, or it's going to say contrast. So instead of doing compare, we can do contrast. Or instead of doing contrast, we can do compare. Or instead of doing continuity, we can do change. And that gives you the complexity point. Then finally, you can talk about multiple viewpoints, and that's big on essays like what I read the thesis on. Let's go back to the thesis. Although it was a religious disagreement, the 30 Years' War was more of a political conflict. So here the thesis would have asked whether the 30 Years' War was more of a political conflict or more of a religious conflict. So I take the position of political conflict, and then finally, in my final paragraph for complexity, then I would talk about, okay, so it's a political conflict, but it was also a religious conflict. So you understand the full side of this event. And this just, in my opinion, it's made just to show that history isn't black and white, right? It's not just this. History can be interpreted. And this point is really measuring to see how you can interpret history. That's really what this whole entire essay is measuring. How well can you interpret history? So the big thing for DBQs to remember is just write about the documents. Write an argument, defend your argument with evidence, and you'll get a bunch of points. A lot of this stuff is not just applicable for 2020. A lot of this stuff, obviously not the open note stuff, but what I talked about, the thesis, what I talked about, complexity, that kind of stuff is applicable to all, or should be applicable to the next year's DBQs, and essays in general as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Yeah, if you guys want to see more of these, like, subscribe, and I'm Max. I'll see you guys.